Alice.
Okay. Did you? Okay. Okay. Well, we hope you and yours are all well. In this difficult time, we can't get together much. And so we are really very pleased to be able to bring you our lectures virtually. This year, the focus of our talks is on exploring conservation issues. We've had one on climate change, another on forest regeneration. And tonight we'll hear Ingrid Haeckel talk about wildlife conservation. In December, Britt Bassinger will speak about trails and public access to woodlands. And by the way, if you missed any of the earlier lectures and would like to hear them, they're available on RPA's website. And now I'd like to introduce Ingrid Haeckel. Ingrid is a conservation and land specialist at the New York State Department of Conservation's Hudson River Estuary program, and she's very knowledgeable about conservation and the habitats and wildlife conservation issues of our state. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Ingrid Haeckel, our speaker for the evening. Okay, Ingrid.
Thanks, Alice. Everyone can hear me all right? Great. Okay, well, thank you all for joining us. Thanks for the introduction, Alice. And I really admire the work of Rensselaer Plateau Alliance, and I've been enjoying seeing your organization grow and all of the great successes you've had, and just the wonderful work that you're doing. And especially during this really challenging time, you know, it's so important to have organizations like yours that are helping to kind of improve access to nature for so many people and providing opportunities to connect with nature. So thank you for the work that you're doing. And I hope everyone is doing all right. It's been a challenging time. I work for the Hudson River Estuary Program, which is a unique program at the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, established to help people enjoy, protect, and revitalize the Hudson River and its valley. We work throughout the 10 counties bordering the tidal Hudson, from Upper New York Harbor to the Federal Dam in Troy, and take an ecosystem-based approach to achieving these many key benefits of a healthy Hudson River and watershed. And within the estuary program, I'm part of a small conservation and land use team that works with communities to conserve natural resources through local planning. And much of our work is focused on helping municipalities to identify their important habitats and water resources and providing the foundation for them to set local priorities and establish plans and policies to protect and manage those resources for the future. We have partnered with RPA for over a decade, and that was beginning with work by my former colleague, Karen Strong, who helped the Alliance with organizing forest landowner workshops and community values mapping, and ultimately development of the Regional Conservation Plan. And since I joined the Estuary Program staff in 2013, I've enjoyed collaborating with the Alliance on other landowner workshops, as well as workshops with landowners, with municipal officials and planners in Plateau towns. And most recently, I had the pleasure of working with the town of Post&Kill Conservation Advisory Council and the Rensselaer Land Trust last year to develop a natural resources inventory for the town that integrates data from both the Plateau Alliance's Regional Conservation Plan and the County Conservation Plan. It sounds like if there's someone who's not muted, please mute yourself if you're joining us. Okay, so this evening, I'm going to start off with, this is kind of an overview of information about kind of habitats and wildlife of conservation concern on the plateau, and a little bit about conservation principles and strategies. So I'll start off by talking a little bit about how geology and land uses have influenced the local ecology, and segue into the Rensselaer Plateau's regional significance and some of the special habitats and wildlife resources that occur here. And I'd like to also then talk a little bit about threats and finally some strategies for conserving vulnerable resources. And as I go through, I'm going to try to sprinkle in some information about mapping tools and resources resources you can use to access more information about the area. And just a disclaimer, I know there are many people listening tonight who are very knowledgeable about the ecology and wildlife of the plateau, and you know your area much better than I do. You know, I'm coming at this from the background of someone who works a lot with biological data at the statewide and regional level and interpreting that for conservation planning. And so I hope I'll be able to share something new with you. The Rensselaer Plateau is a distinct geologic landform. This is shown here, an excerpt from the state bedrock geology map. So the Rensselaer Formation, which is this large feature here, is underlying the plateau and comprised predominantly of graywacke, which is a poorly sorted type of sandstone that that's highly resistant to weathering and erosion. The sediments that form the plateau were originally deposited over 500 million years ago in a deep ocean trench, and they were the result of underwater landslides caused by volcanic eruptions. And later on, around 440 million years ago, continental drift forced these rocks up and over the existing continent, coinciding with the rise of the Taconic Mountains. And that was, those mountains were at one time higher than the Himalayas are today. And over millions of years, rain, snow, wind, and ice have eroded those mountains down to what we know today as the Taconic Ridge and what is the Rensselaer Plateau. So here's a photo of Rensselaer graywacke, a boulder on the plateau today this bedrock is quite acidic. It has contributed to the development of acidic soils and influenced the resulting plant communities we find on the plateau. It is notable, though, that there are some interesting occurrences of limestone and marble that are on the northern and eastern boundary of the plateau. Those are calcium-rich bedrock that are associated with a number of rare plants and natural communities and the formation of caves, and they happen to be rather unique places on the plateau that are very distinct from the rest of that major landform. Then around 1.6 million years ago, the first of several ice ages began, with ice advancing and retreating and blanketing most of New York. The most recent advance, of course, was the Wisconsin glaciation, which had its height around 21,000 years ago and covered our region with as much as 1 to 2 miles thick of ice. Those glacial periods further eroded the plateau and scoured out our valleys. And when the glacier finally retreated around 14,000 years ago, it left behind significant deposits of sand, gravel, and boulders blanketing the landscape. The retreating glacier also left behind many large chunks of ice that were surrounded by or became buried by accumulations of outwashed deposits from under the glacier. And eventually those ice blocks melted, leaving behind depressions that resulted in the formation of many kettle, ponds, and lakes on the plateau. And there are other natural lakes on the plateau that were formed also by ice scouring out little basins in the bedrock and by sediments from the glacier that were deposited, blocking drainage from small valleys. With the retreat of the Ice Age, plant life was quick to establish across our region, eventually forming an extensive forest that was dotted with wetlands, ponds, and lakes. And the plateau has enough elevation from the surrounding Hudson Valley to create a notably cooler and wetter climate that has favored the establishment of forests and wetland communities that are more commonly found in the Adirondack Mountains and Vermont than in the Hudson Valley. People were pretty soon to arrive on the scene. Native Americans settled in the Hudson River Valley between 6,000 and 4,000 years ago. This is the ancestral territory of the Mohican tribe, which lived most of the year along the Hudson River with its very abundant food sources. And But they would have used the Rensselaer Plateau for hunting and gathering, and in moving kind of northeast toward Vermont for hunting moose during the winter time. And Native American burning practices are interesting and help explain possibly some of the differences in vegetation that we see in surrounding Hudson Valley areas, compared and on the plateau escarpment in some places compared to the central and interior plateau. And that's because Native Americans repeatedly burned forests in the Hudson Valley over millennia, which favored the establishment of Appalachian oak hickory and pine forests that are more fire tolerant. And they did that for many reasons, including to have better hunting conditions and for their blueberry crops and to make travel easier. But the plateau was isolated and rugged enough that it was probably spared from this burning regime and maintained that northern hardwood forest that is not tolerant to fire. Oopsie. So Europeans arrived in the Hudson Valley in the 1600s and eventually displaced the Native Americans that were living here. But towns weren't established on the plateau until after the Revolutionary War. And at that time, settlers were mainly subsistence farmers who also cleared forests quite widely for charcoal production that was used to fuel the foundries in Troy. And most of the plateau was probably cut over for during the course of the 19th century. However, many areas were never farmed or pastured, and they were left to revert to forest. And that's important ecologically because it explains the persistence of many native plant communities and the limited spread of invasive species in many forests on the plateau. When you compare areas that were used for pasture or that were cultivated for extensive periods of time, the forests that have come back in those areas are quite different. So that kind of caps off my brief ecological history. And fast forward to the 21st century, I'm going to talk a little bit about the habitats and wildlife we see on the plateau today. And begin by illustrating some of the regional context and publicly available data that we have from New York State and the Hudson River Estuary Program and other organizations. I'm going to share some screenshots of the Hudson Valley Natural Resource Mapper, which is an online interactive mapping tool that I help to manage on the DEC's website. And this is a map here showing major forest areas of New York State, of which Rensselaer Plateau is one of them. And the plateau really began to gain some recognition as an important conservation priority beginning in the late 90s and early 2000s on the basis of these data that are widely available. And it wasn't until more recently that we have a lot more interesting and very detailed data developed for the plateau. So let's start though at the regional scale. And this may be a little bit hard to see. So this shape here is what is referring to the plateau generally. The Hudson River Estuary Program, my program, recognized the Rensselaer Plateau as a significant biodiversity area based on the large contiguous forest and wetland habitats and diversity of plants, animals, and natural communities that are unique to this region. And that's part of our Hudson River Estuary Wildlife and Habitat Conservation Framework from the mid-2000s. And it's the New York State has also recognized the Rensselaer Plateau as a priority in the state open space plan dating back to the late 1990s. So this is the Rensselaer Plateau, and next to it, of course, we have the upper part of the Taconic Ridge, which is also designated as a significant biodiversity area. Audubon, New York, around that time period, also designated much of the plateau as a statewide important bird area, citing the high diversity and abundance of forest birds and birds of regional conservation concern, and its significance to the migratory species using what they call the Atlantic flyway. So birds that migrate kind of from up and down the Atlantic corridor. And I'll talk a little bit more about bird communities in a little bit. The Nature Conservancy also identified the plateau's forests as matrix forest blocks in part of an ecoregional plan in the early 2000s, citing the high quality and health of these large forest ecosystems. And the term matrix forest refers to forests that are usually at least 15,000 acres in extent, capable of withstanding and recovering from major disturbances like hurricanes or wildfire fires, major blowdowns, invasive species, and conserving populations of forest interior wildlife, and providing a source of wildlife for the surrounding area. More recently, last year, we partnered with the Estuary program partnered with the New York Natural Heritage Program to assess forest condition in the Hudson River Estuary watershed, looking at size, fragmentation, wildlife habitat value, and other ecosystem service values, including carbon sequestration value. And again, the plateau kind of jumps out here, and this is roughly the plateau boundary again. With the majority of plateau forests falling within the 95th or 99th percentile in these blue and the purple color. And that's in comparison with all other Hudson Valley forests, including forests of the Catskills, the Hudson Highlands, and the Taconic Ridge. So this is just further confirming that the value of these forest blocks. And if you're interested in exploring these data further, I'll share the links to this mapper and the other tools I'll mention at the end of my talk through the chat box. In the last regional context example, there are two data sets I'll refer to that relate to the value of the plateau for biodiversity in a changing climate. And climate change, we know, is expected to shift species ranges and rearrange habitats in ways that we can't predict right now. This map shows modeling from the Nature Conservancy that is to predict areas that are most likely to support biodiversity into the future based on landscape complexity and connectedness. Sites that have diverse physical environments, complex topography, and connected habitats are places that are most likely to support a diversity of plants, animals, and habitats both today and in the future. And the Rensselaer Plateau, there's an outline here around the plateau boundary. The red is expected to have above average resiliency, but the darkest green areas are the areas that are predicted to be most resilient, and those are along the escarpment area, most likely, again, because of the complexity of the topography in those areas, in addition to the other factors. This next map shows a different component of that modeling, looking at what they refer to as climate flow zones. And climate flow, it models the gradual movement of populations of plants and animals in response to changes in the climate. And that's based on connectedness and permeability of natural landscape and climatic gradients. And it also indicates, again, the plateau is showing up as having a high flow value based on the connectedness and permeability of that landscape. So that's kind of a good indication that the plateau will play an important role into the future in the movement of plants and animals in response to climate change, and serving as a stronghold for nature. The Regional Conservation Plan for the Rensselaer Plateau was completed in 2013, and it contains a very comprehensive ecological assessment of the plateau that was undertaken by local ecologist Dr. David Hunt in order to prioritize areas for conservation, stewardship, and management. Dr. Hunt mapped habitats for the entire 118,000 acre plateau, and he identified 73 of New York's 174 types of natural communities. And a natural ecological community is simply a group of plants and animals that share a common environment. So many ecosystems on the plateau are ranked by the New York Natural Heritage Program as uncommon or vulnerable in New York. There are also examples of natural communities that that program has recognized as being high quality examples of more common community types, and that's because of their size, undisturbed and intact condition, and the larger landscape context that they occur in. So the data that's shown here is available through a different website called databasin.org, and you can sign up for a free account to log in and browse the data sets and add them and create your own maps. You can get to this also through RPA's website, and I'll share the link for that. They have a gallery of different map layers that you can play around with. It's a pretty cool tool. So this is a great way to explore the natural communities and other ecological data from the conservation plan on your own. You can click on the map and pull up information about the individual community occurrences. And for example, what I've clicked on is an example of spruce flats, which are abundant in this headwaters, kind of upper area of the Post-and-Kill stream and watershed. And you can, if you wanted to learn more about spruce flats, you can navigate over to the Natural Heritage Program's website, where they have a series of conservation guides online, and you can search and look up a natural community by name and pull up a conservation guide that will tell you more about what a spruce flat is, what its characteristics are, conservation values for wildlife and plants, and some conservation and management guidance about it. So here's a closer image of a spruce flat, which is a relatively common type of mixed forest up in the Adirondacks, but much less common on the plateau. So spruce flats occur along the margins of swamps and low-lying areas next to streams and other water bodies, and they tend to be dominated by red spruce and red maple, and with some other tree species mixed in. So I'll kind of segue into talking a little bit more about some of the different natural communities of the plateau. Hemlock-northern hardwood forest is by far the most common upland forest community on the Rensselaer Plateau. David Hunt mapped over 45,000 acres of this forest type. And while it's relatively common in New York, it's particularly threatened right now by the spread of hemlock woolly adelgid, which is an invasive insect that kills mature hemlock trees, sometimes within the span of a few years. And the plateau has fortunately been spared from that so far. However, there are reports of adelgid on the Taconic Ridge in the town of Berlin, and also in northern Columbia County. Beech-maple mesic forest is another type of dominant forest on the plateau that's often intermixed with the hemlock-northern hardwood forest. In this case, beech and sugar maple are the dominant trees, and it tends to occur on moist, well-drained, and acidic soils. These are really lovely forests to walk through, but especially in the springtime, where they happen to typically have a lot of ephemeral wildflowers, such as rue anemone on the left and red trillium, which can be found blooming in the time before the deciduous trees leaf out. And there are nice high quality examples of these two forest types at the Post-and-Kill Community Forest. The edges of the plateau, which are also called the escarpment, have a distinct steep and rocky character that supports many different types of forest communities, such as Appalachian oak hickory forest, which is very common on the escarpment and probably a reflection of some prior fire history in this transition zone with the Hudson Valley. The escarpment woodlands also are major complexes of have major complexes of rocky summits and exposed bedrock, and they'll tend to have like a more open woodland character, and that includes places like Slide Mountain and Bunker Hill in Grafton, and Snake Hill and Post-and-Kill. And some of the escarpment is also characterized by talus slopes, which are an accumulation of fallen rock fragments underneath steep cliffs or rock outcroppings. These are ecologically significant places, and they can have interesting plants, but they can also be concentrations of denning sites for bobcat and porcupine, which will use the crevices and caves in these rock debris piles, slopes. The significant intact forests of the plateau provide habitat for a very impressive diversity of wide-ranging mammals that are not typical of the greater Capital District region. And these include black bear, fisher, bobcat, and moose. These animals depend on the well-connected habitats of the plateau to thrive, and they may have extremely large ranges. For example, a moose may use a territory of up to 50 square miles of mixed forest and wetland habitat to meet their needs, while a fisher may have a home range of up to 10 square miles. So they're particularly dependent on those large forest areas. And these are just some nice images from the trail cams at the Post and Kill Community Forest of a bear taking a stroll one evening and a moose out in one of the wetlands on that site. And I believe that moose have also been spotted at the Albert Community Forest. Large core forests of the plateau also support many forest nesting songbirds that are in decline region-wide, and these include scarlet tanagers, wood thrush, cerulean warbler, and black and white warbler. Just as an example, wood thrush populations have been reduced by half in the past 40 years here in the New York region. And these species are area sensitive, which means they require large habitat areas to successfully establish breeding territories, nest, and raise their young. For example, cerulean warbler, they prefer contiguous forest habitat that exceeds 3,000 acres in extent. Plateau forests also support many species of forest-dwelling raptors, such as the red-shouldered hawk and northern goshawk. Goshawks also require very extensive mature forests of over 5,000 acres. Typically, they nest at least 1,000 feet away from human habitations or paved roads. There is currently a new statewide breeding bird atlas underway, which will hopefully give us a better sense of the status of these and other birds on the plateau and around the state. The last atlas was conducted about 20 years ago, so a lot of the data we have is not very current in that respect. The plateau also supports a large number of young forest bird species and other wildlife that are of conservation concern increasingly. And that's because as more former agricultural lands have grown into mature forests and natural disturbances like fires have been suppressed over time, young forest habitat has dwindled in New York and New England. And this has caused declines in many species that were once very common in those areas, such as the whippoorwill, Canada warbler, and ruffed grouse. Whippoorwill populations have declined by nearly 60% between the 1980s and 2000s in New York, and they were recently proposed for listing as special concern because of the rate at which the populations have declined. The plateau is also home to, it's at the northern range of the eastern box turtles distribution, which makes it an exceptionally important area for conservation in the context of climate change and species migration. We know kind of protecting those northern home range areas is very important as species begin to move. Box turtles spend most of their time in upland deciduous forests near streams and at the edges of meadows and shrublands. Another species here is northern long-eared bat that was recently federally listed as threatened, and that northern long-eared bat, along with other bat species, have had their populations really decimated by white nose syndrome, which arrived in our area around 2006 and has led to the die-off of up to 99% of bats in some cases. So these bat species are really have been significantly impacted. There is a bat colony nearby in the town of Berlin in a cave, again, in part of that plateau area that has marble bedrock geology. So again, a unique feature there. And bats from that colony will probably forage during the summer months on the Rensselaer Plateau or on the nearby Taconic Ridge. So forests are providing important habitat for this species. In addition to the expansive forests of the plateau, there are many intact wetland communities, including high quality examples of swamps, such as this hemlock red maple swamp. And a swamp is just a term for a forested wetland, and they are used by a wide range of animals. There are also a variety of emergent wetlands that, such as marshes, as well as ponds and lakes, and these open herbaceous wetlands are especially important for the habitat for a variety of marsh birds and waterfowl, and they include rare and declining species like least bittern and American bittern as well, and American black duck. The plateau also supports healthy populations of river otters, which commonly inhabit these types of open wetlands. In addition, and one of the more unique features of the plateau are many examples of small acidic wetland communities that are not commonly found outside of the Adirondacks. These include examples of several types of acidic bog and inland poor fin and sedge meadow. Some of these wetlands occur in the glacial kettles that I mentioned earlier in my talk, or shallow bedrock depressions. Many of them can be described, these can be described as peatlands, which is a term owing to the deep accumulation of peat, and that's partially decayed vegetation and organic matter. Peatlands support many unusual plants like sundews and pitcher plants and orchids and that are adapted to the acidic conditions, and rare insects like the forsythia emerald dragonfly shown here on the left. That is a state rare dragonfly. It's the only known occurrence here in Rensselaer County. It's a species that's really only known from northern New York otherwise, but has been found in a bog on the plateau. Peatlands also happen to store vast amounts of carbon, far exceeding the equivalent area of forest in many cases, and that makes their protection very important in terms of climate change. And this is an aerial view of the Big Beaver Bog at the Post and Kill Community Forest, I believe. But some of the other notable peatland complexes on the plateau are Hosford Pond Bog in Post and Kill and the Cranberry Fly. Intermittent woodland pools are small isolated wetlands in a forested setting with standing water during the winter and spring months that dries up by mid to late summer, typically during a normal year. This prevents the establishment of fish populations and makes these habitats important for breeding by a group of forest amphibians, including the wood frog and spotted salamander shown here. So they spend most of their lives in the surrounding upland forest, in the forest floor, and will make their way over to the breeding pool in the spring and then return to the forest. So these are I want to make sure to mention them. We run a special citizen science program about amphibian migrations and road crossings where volunteers go out and monitor the big nights when amphibians come out and cross the roads on their way to the pool. I think we have some volunteers on the plateau who participate in that program, but these wetlands tend to be unmapped, overlooked. They're not protected by state or federal wetland regulations, but they have a very outsized biological importance because of the breeding habitat. And the last type of habitat I'll touch on is the plateau's important streams. And the forests and wetlands that I've been talking about help provide clean water to many streams draining off of the plateau, and they keep the temperatures of the water cold, which provides valuable cold water habitat for fish like brook trout, which is our only native trout in New York. And this map is showing sensitive cold water stream habitat that provides that supports brook trout populations on the plateau. You can see many of these streams are have documented brook trout and are expected to support brook trout based on nearby occurrences. So that's another important resource, these cold water stream habitats. And you may be surprised to know that there are actually migratory fish that make their way onto the plateau. These are American eel, glass eels, which are born in the Sargasso Sea, thousands of miles away. They they drift on ocean currents and swim up into our tributaries. And these fish are able to surmount major obstacles like the Barberville Fall. Mature American eels have been documented in the Poston Kill above Barberville Fall in Poston Kill, and I think historically back in the 80s as far up as Dyken Pond. So they were certainly historically a part of the ecosystem here, and they do persist in some places. This is another species that's really been in decline, along with brook trout, because of the loss and degradation of stream habitat and fragmentation of stream habitat by dams and by poorly installed or designed culverts that block passage for aquatic organisms. Just two more stream wildlife species I'll mention, documented from the plateau, are wood turtles, which are, they live along low gradient perennial streams typically, and the adjacent riparian or streamside area. And the southern pygmy clubtail, which is a state rare dragonfly that has been documented along some high quality, high gradient streams on the plateau. So I'm going to segue and talk a little bit about some of the major threats to these habitats and species, starting with habitat loss and fragmentation. Unplanned or poorly planned, I don't know what happened here, but unplanned or poorly planned development continues to be a major threat of to natural systems, and over time it can result in this death by 1,000 cuts. Fragmentation is the process where large forests are, they become divided by new roads and driveways and housing developments. Though a driveway may not seem like a significant feature, each time we put a disturbance through a forest, we're creating new edges. And the edge of a forest is actually a distinct habitat from the perspective of many wildlife. It has distinct microclimate conditions. It can have different temperature, different light levels, wind, etc. And there, in addition, there's often different and higher levels of predation along forest edges. And these are also avenues for the spread of invasive species. So that's why many sensitive wildlife species will try to avoid these areas, or if they're in them, they don't do very well. So though it's not readily visible to our eye in many cases, edge effects can in fact extend for hundreds of feet into a forest. And as a result, when this forest is divided by a road or a driveway and into two, the amount of core interior forest habitat is actually diminished by much more than that. And you're left with a much higher percentage of edge to interior core forest habitat. And that will change the types of species that can survive and persist in those forests. Building even a single house in the forest may not appear to have a significant impact, but research done in the Adirondacks has found that construction of a home and all the disturbance that we bring with us from our outdoor lighting to noise and lawn care to domestic animals can alter the presence and behavior of wildlife by up to 600 feet or more from a house lot. And that creates a roughly 30-acre wildlife shadow around the house where wildlife habitat is either the usage is diminished or significantly altered. And so you can think about that kind of being replicated many times over on the landscape, how quickly that might diminish the overall habitat quality of a forest. But of course, you know, one of the greatest threats right now, and in addition to fragmentation, is the introduction of new forest pathogens and invasive species and pests. That are brought in inadvertently in most cases by, you know, through landscaping and international commerce. And our Hudson Valley forests have been significantly impacted in recent decades by the spread of hemlock woolly adelgid and emerald ash borer, among other things, which are expected to eventually kill most of the large trees of these species. It's likely that the plateau will not be spared from that, unfortunately. The plateau is already experiencing impacts from beech bark disease and other tree diseases. And there are other emerging threats like Asian longhorn beetle and things we haven't even, you know, seen yet that may show up on our doorstep a year from now or longer. So we need to keep our eyes out for these things and try to catch them quickly when they arrive. And the partnerships for regional invasive species management across the state are helping work with communities and groups like yours to do that. Forest regeneration is also a major problem in New York due to overabundant deer and competing vegetation that shades out seedlings. Today's tree seedlings are tomorrow's forest. So, which is why managing forests to increase regeneration is so important for the future of our forests. And it sounds like you just recently had a lecture on that topic, which is great. And last but not least, you know, climate change, of course, is increasing the frequency of extreme precipitation events and flooding, as well as droughts, and will eventually require many species and ecosystems to shift. Unless we change our emissions drastically, the climate of upstate New York could be as warm as South Carolina by the end of this century. We've already seen significant increases in average annual temperature, and especially in our winter temperature, and decreases in snowfall and kind of increased incidence of freeze-thaw events during the winter time that never were typical before. So the question is not really whether ecosystems and habitats will change in response to the warming climate, but when and what types of novel ecosystems will emerge. So that kind of really brings us back to the resilience data I showed, and trying to think about how we conserve places for the future, understanding that these resources will be changing. And that brings me to our basic conservation principles. And these really apply whether you're thinking about managing habitat on your property and, you know, a particular site, or at the town-wide level or the plateau level or beyond. We want to think about preserving large, natural, intact areas where possible and avoiding further habitat fragmentation, trying to identify and preserve broad wildlife corridors, protecting those resilient sites for the future, not just at, you know, the areas that are important today, but thinking into the future. Establishing natural buffers around wetlands and streams and other sensitive areas to protect our water quality and the stream and water habitat. Minimizing pavement and trying to promote more compact development, and especially promoting infill development or development in areas that have already been altered. So these are the general principles. Local government plays a very important role. New York is a home rule state, and most of the decisions about new development in our communities happen at the local level. So it's members of our planning and zoning boards, as well as our town boards that are setting important policy about land use and conservation. So those are important opportunities if you're concerned about conservation in your community, to think about volunteering and serving on one of those boards. There are opportunities to incorporate conservation principles into the conservation comprehensive plan for your community, which is the blueprint for the future. It's the community's vision for how you want to grow and develop, as well as how to conserve the important natural resources your community has. Some communities have developed their own open space plans that identify local priorities and strategies for conservation. There are opportunities to incorporate conservation and resource protection into local zoning through the establishment of conservation overlay zoning for resources, or setbacks from sensitive areas, changes in density calculations, and so forth. Also in subdivision regulations, your town can adopt local laws to protect wetlands and streams, filling in the gaps from state and federal regulations. And even in the routine environmental review of proposed developments, there always are opportunities to identify and promote conservation of habitat as decisions are being made. So one way to do that is to think about joining or forming a conservation advisory council. These are enabled by New York State legislation. I believe, the town of Post-and-Kill, who I worked with, they have a conservation advisory council. The town of Nassau has a natural resource committee. I'm not sure if any other plateau towns have these established, but if not, it's always possible to propose one. And they are happening in Rensselaer County. Just this year, the town of East Greenbush formed a conservation council, and the city of Troy. So other communities are reestablishing these, which were more common back in the early 1970s. But they provide a formal structure within local government to address environmental issues, and they can provide a supporting role with environmental review of development, with establishing new land use policy, working on climate smart communities as well as another thing that these groups are doing, and so forth. Of course, I also encourage you to volunteer with RPA. I know RPA is doing many wonderful projects, and I encourage you to check out the opportunities there. And our own Trees for Tribs program at the Hudson River Estuary program, we provide free trees and shrubs for stream planting projects to try and restore streamside habitat. If you happen to own land along a stream and have opportunity, or if there is municipally owned land that could be restored, please take advantage of this program. And lastly, as a landowner, think about learning more about your land, and I'm sure that's part of why you're here today, because you're interested in knowing more. But think about, use these resources that I mentioned to look up your property and try to understand more about what's been mapped on your property or nearby, and how your land fits into the larger landscape in terms of being part of a large forest or a stream corridor, or where there's opportunity for wildlife movement through your land. And these are just some tips. This is a nice guide from the Wildlife Conservation Society about things you can do as a landowner to minimize your footprint, avoiding wildlife conflict by managing your compost and your garbage and your bird feeders, and landscaping with native plants, avoiding lawn chemicals, and so forth. If you own a forest, think about developing a forest stewardship plan, working on managing invasives on your land, and there are many other opportunities. So I'll finish up with some resources. Of course, the Rensselaer Plateau Regional Conservation Plan is a really great education resource. There were also some nice guides developed for both municipal officials and landowners. Those are on RPA's website, and as well as the link to the database and galleries. And from the Estuary program, we have a guide to conserving natural areas and wildlife in your community that talks more about the strategies for conservation. We have our natural resource mapper, and I'll share the link to the Natural Heritage Program Conservation Guide. So when I exit full screen, I'll put those links in the chat box. But for now, thanks for your attention. Thanks for tuning in and joining us. And I'll be happy to try to answer any questions you might have. Wish you a happy Thanksgiving. These are turkeys from the Post and Kill Community Forest Trail Cam. And I also wish to thank the members of the RPA board who offered to share some of their photos with me for this presentation. Thanks for contributing those wonderful images. So Alice, I'm not sure I can open up the chat right now. And wondering if there's any publicly available fish data, especially for brook trout. So there is a New York State Atlas of Inland Fishes, which is in part where some of the information about brook trout comes from, and other information that went into that modeling is from DEC Bureau of Fisheries survey work, but it's not kind of readily publicly available. Another indication of where you have trout streams is to look at the New York State water quality classifications and standards, which map trout streams. There's a trout and a trout spawning standard, and those are on the Hudson Valley Natural Resource Mapper. Let me go ahead and copy my links into the chat for you guys. So if you go to the Natural Resource Mapper under Streams and Watersheds, you'll be able to pull up the trout streams. And if you go under Biodiversity, you can pull up the Coldwater stream habitat areas that I showed on that map. So there's another question here about if there are any preventative measures to save the hemlocks. And short answer is that I'm not an expert on this, but I know that for small areas, there are some options to treat the trees with an insecticide, and there are different ways that that can be applied. I think either through an injection, and also there's a way that it can be kind of buried, something can be buried right next to the tree that works. So those methods are being used to selectively try to save hemlocks in some areas, especially in parks and preserves that get a lot of use, where there are lots of hemlocks along the trails, and other notable hemlock populations. At a larger landscape scale, there have been there's a biocontrol that has been experimented with. It's a beetle, I believe, that they release. But I think it's had limited success. So I would recommend going to the Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management, the Capital Region PRISM, to find out more information about hemlock woolly adelgid, and RPA may also be able to guide you some more. I know that in the meantime, certainly if you see something you think might be hemlock woolly adelgid on the plateau, that you should definitely report it to DEC and bring it to their attention. Okay. There's a question of all the places that are accessible to the public on the plateau, what are the top 5 that you should check out to get a taste of the diversity of habitats, plants, etc.? Well, I think an RPA board member would probably be better suited to answer that question than I, because my experiences have been pretty, I would say that when COVID is over and outings can resume, I would highly recommend the Plateau Traverse hike, which I myself have only done half of, and I'd love to come back and do the other half or do the full thing. But for me, that was a wonderful experience to get a sense. It was a very long hike, but really walked through a variety of habitats. I've been to the Post and Kill Community Forest many times, and that's a lovely place. But Jim, or I don't know if you want to jump in and talk.
Sure. I'll say a few things. Post-kill community forest is great. It's actually fairly diverse in and of its own right. At only 436 acres, there's a lot of different habitats you can see there. The Dike and Pond Environmental Education Center is really great. They've got some amazing wetlands and forests there. and the, kind of the shoreline. Then if you want to get down into the some of the escarpment type habitats, you can visit the Grafton Forest or and the Albert Family Community Forest. Barberville Falls Preserve has, some unique things there with the gorge. I'm sure some other people can jump in. And we're working on some projects that will add some more diversity to that next, with some, maybe some rocky summits and some things like that.
Great.
Yeah, maybe another board member will want to say something.
In the meantime, I see there's one other question relating to subdivision review and consideration of whether development is in keeping with character of the natural and built environment. There are a lot of different questions that are answered during the required state environmental review of a subdivision. And I would encourage you to look at the data from the regional conservation plan. There's, always an opportunity to comment during the seeker process. So that could be an opportunity to suggest that data that may not have been considered be incorporated. But again, I also would recommend looking for opportunities to participate and perhaps volunteer and get involved at the local level. Are there rattlesnakes or copperheads on the plateau? I was just reviewing the HERP Atlas data. So there was a reptile and amphibian atlas in New York State that was completed during the 1990s. And, I certainly hope there will be another one, an update of that atlas sometime soon. There are no records for timber rattlesnake or copperhead according to those data. In the regional conservation plan, there was a note in one of the appendices on wildlife species that timber rattlesnake is possibly reported, but again, there are no official records of timber rattlesnake on the plateau. And neither for copperhead. I didn't see any records for copperheads. And if anyone else knows more, feel free to chime in. And there was a question about what makes an area an escarpment region. And the escarpment is escarpment is a term for the kind of the steep, the edge of that geologic form of the plateau has very steep slopes and cliffs, and that's referred to as an escarpment. Someone heard rat snake or racer snake, long and black. Yes, I did see records for black rat snake and for eastern racer. So those, am I getting confused that those are, that does occur on the plateau according to the HERP Atlas. Or maybe I think one of those records was in the conservation plan and one was in the HERP Atlas, and I'm not remembering which one was which. And the data in the conservation plan, of course, David Hunt has done very extensive field work as part of his mapping of those natural communities. And so he incorporated his field observations into that species list. And it's a good point to make that many areas, they haven't been formally surveyed by a biologist. And so we're always working based on the best available data, but it doesn't mean that there couldn't be other records out there. Any Jefferson or mole salamanders? Spotteds are quite common, but I've seen some odd looking mole salamanders. Interesting. No, there were only records of spotted salamanders in the Herp Atlas, and I wondered about that. And I wouldn't be surprised if there might be other mole salamander species. So if you go out again, I would recommend taking some photographs of whatever you find, and you can share that, report that back to DEC as part of the Amphibian Migration and Road Crossings project. And we could also share it with the DEC biologist for if there's any new species that are kind of the rare species identified. Bear concentration on the plateau. As far as I'm aware, black bears are abundant. There's good populations on the plateau, but there's not, I'm not aware of a specific concentration area or any mapping related to bear. In general, a lot of the mapping that we have is for the uncommon species, and we don't have mapping for wildlife that are widely, widely present. A mountain lion in the forest in Cropseyville. Mountain lions are not present in New York State. It's possible you saw a bobcat, and bobcats are often confused with mountain lions. So there are bobcats on the plateau. Certainly, if you feel compelled that you have some evidence of a mountain lion, you can share that with DEC, but there is at present are no known populations of mountain lions in the state. Great. Is there any effort by conservation authorities to address the deer issue, to address overabundant deer? Well, there's certainly that's a complex question. I mean, there are hunting regulations for deer, and those have been updated in response to various things, but I guess I'm not sure I can answer that question. Leave that to a DEC biologist. I think that the overabundance of deer in our forests is a large issue that is not easily resolved with and of course deer are important game species. As a researcher, what are some of the hurdles or setbacks in our field? Well, so I work again mostly with local governments and other partners, including nonprofits like RPA and our nonprofit land trust partners on conservation planning and incorporating natural resources into local planning. And, I think there's a lot of interest in that topic. And one of the, there are various challenges, but I think that our land use system, which is very decentralized in New York, is a challenge because so much burden is put on local governments to regulate land use, and those decisions are made by volunteers who often don't have professional experience or professional background, and there's a lot that they need to know and understand, and a lot of responsibility and interest to balance there. And there's a lot of turnover, and so I think there's an issue of knowledge. There just being a lot of turnover on volunteer boards that can be a challenge with trying to promote an advanced policy and at the local level. So there's a question about illegal dump sites, and I would definitely report that to the enforcement number for DEC Region 4, if you're aware of an illegal dump site. what's the best way to view the Natural Heritage Program data? I would recommend using the Hudson Valley Natural Resource Mapper, and under biodiversity, you can see important areas mapped for rare species, and it's still generalized. It won't show you the specific location of a rare plant or animal by species, but they're depending on whether you're, if you're an individual or working with an organization, there is more detailed information available. But you can get and I would also recommend going to the Regional Conservation Plan, because that'll give you lists of the specific species that have been identified on the plateau. Well, I've enjoyed presenting, and I hope that was informative for everyone. I appreciate the opportunity to join you this evening. And you can always feel free to follow up with an email if you have any questions. We also have our own conservation
Ingrid,
and land. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say, on behalf of everyone, I'd like to thank you for a really interesting and informative talk. And when I said that you were knowledgeable about habitat and wildlife conservation, I think that was an understatement. So I think, we all learned a lot. And thank you.
Thank you, Alice. Thanks very much. Yeah, I was going to say in closing, we also have a Conservation and Land Use 101 webinar series, and that, that's geared towards folks who are involved in municipal decision making. But I will share the link just in case, because there are recorded webinars that are about some of these things that may be of interest, and that describe some of the data sources. So I'm just going to pop that into the chat box as well. There. All right. Well, thank you very much. Have a great evening, and be in touch. And happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you, Ingrid. That was great.
Thank you.